Have you still not watched The Clone Wars? Because I'll tell you what, I didn't come to the show until years after it originally aired, and it's one of my biggest fandom regrets. Because despite an initially unfavorable reception by fans as a whole, The Clone Wars spent 7 seasons executing the purest example of George Lucas's vision since A New Hope. And the result was some of the best mythology, character arcs, and story beats that Star Wars has ever seen. But the question is, how is that even possible in the first place? I'm Eric, welcome to Utini. Now hit that like button, don't forget to subscribe, because today we're gonna see why it can be argued that The Clone Wars is the best Star Wars project of all time. In 2024, the entertainment industry looks quite different than it used to. More movies than ever are being created for home viewing, our biggest franchises now appear on live-action television, and the power of the movie star is now far less important than the power of IP. But we still have some constants. Star Wars is still creating wonderful new projects, GTA 5 is still selling millions of copies, and many adults still feel like animation is just for kids. And while I can understand that feeling to an extent, it's a shame, because we happen to be living in another golden age of animation right now. There are more art styles, more story concepts, and more talented creators working in the animated space than ever before. And yet, there is still a massive audience that won't cross that line to try them out, because the majority of the exposure they've had to animation has been through SpongeBob or Looney Tunes. Hey, no shade to either, by the way. The Krusty Krab pizza was legendary. But nonetheless, the barrier still remains as it has for years, especially when it comes to Star Wars. Now, back in 2008, this barrier was really put to the test when the animated movie The Clone Wars hit theaters to give audiences their first main Star Wars story since Revenge of the Sith. And this experiment, well, didn't quite go according to plan. The movie debuted a brand new style of animation, and rather than a complete saga film, it ended up being more like 3 episodes of TV rolled into one. Add in some admittedly questionable humor and dialogue, and the movie received a paltry 19% on Rotten Tomatoes and only grossed $68 million worldwide. So naturally, they gave up, right? Wrong. I mean, come on. Have you ever met George Lucas? Rather than scrapping the project, Lucasfilm took as many lessons as they could and pressed on to create one of the most important projects in the Star Wars universe, thanks to George and, of course, a young animation filmmaker named Dave Filoni. Because of George, Dave, and countless others, The Clone Wars became an international phenomenon, garnering 7 seasons of television and becoming the only project ever fully resurrected by pure fan devotion. But if you're still holding out on watching this series, why should you start now? I mean, aside from the accolades and the fan fervor, what makes The Clone Wars a truly fantastic piece of Star Wars that's actually great for adults too? Well, it's simple. More than any other Star Wars project to date, The Clone Wars expands the galaxy, creates long-term, complex character arcs, and presents the most fully realized version of George Lucas's dream we have ever seen. Even if you don't like the prequel films, it's hard to deny the impact they had on what we think of as Star Wars. Like if I say, think of Star Wars. There's a high possibility that some of the first images that pop into your mind will involve that era in some way, purely due to the massive amount of mythology that it added to the saga. I mean, we have the entire look of the Jedi Council, the existence of more than 2 lightsabers on screen at a time, the clones, Coruscant, Naboo, Mustafar, pod racing. The prequels actually plugged so many new things into the mythology of Star Wars that it almost felt cramped at times. And this is where The Clone Wars excels beautifully. Because all of that new mythology that came around in the prequels, The Clone Wars incorporates all of that and multiplies it by 1,000 while giving it time to breathe. We see episodes on familiar planets like Kamino and Geonosis, but we also explore biomes never before seen on screen like Ryloth and Mandalore. Because while too much planet hopping can convolute the story of a singular film, episode arcs sprinkled throughout multiple seasons have the freedom to travel and expand. This episodic nature also allows the Clone Wars to present a variety of types of storytelling that all fit within the wider galactic conflict. There are stories of political infighting between the separatists. There are episodes about the dynamics between the soldiers on the front lines and on distant outposts. We witness Jedi issues regarding pacifism and aggression, discover new machinations of Palpatine and other Darksiders, and even deeper histories of people like the Banking Clan. Because the Clone Wars as a whole is very aptly named. It is not a show about a single section of people, it's a show about a galaxy-spanning war over a number of years. So the limits on the stories you can tell are almost non-existent. Part of the reason that I fell in love with Star Wars in the first place was because of how much I loved the universe that George created. I loved the planets, the people, the technology. Every part of it felt real and unlike anything I had ever seen. And the Clone Wars recaptures that sense of wonder and discovery and richness time and time again in truly stunning animation. I mean, the richness of the textures, the use of color, and even the animated camera movement allow you to fall in love with parts of Star Wars that you never even knew existed. Even new characters. If we've said it once, we've said it 100 times. Characters are the backbone of Star Wars. Yes, the frigid landscape of Hoth and the bucolic vistas of Naboo can help you fall in love with the universe, but without people you actually care about interacting within a larger story, it can all fall flat. Now, luckily, the Clone Wars excels in this, not only by creating new, fully formed characters that have now established themselves within the Star Wars pantheon, but also by fleshing out stories of those that maybe needed a little bit more time to cook during their initial appearances. But let's start with the new, the shiny, the rookies, if you will. The pure amount of new characters that the Clone Wars introduces is immense. I mean, it's 7 seasons of television, so there are bound to be plenty of new faces. But what this show does especially well is introduce new characters who stick with you for years and years afterward. Let's start with the most obvious, Ahsoka Tano, possibly my favorite Star Wars character of all time. She's one of the most recognizable characters in the saga. She's appeared in 5 different Star Wars shows, including her own. She has a book all about her, she has a clothing line essentially based on her entire look, and she's a character you can actually meet at Disneyland. And it all started with a movie that absolutely bombed. Humble beginnings, huh? From the start of the Clone Wars, Ahsoka was a central figure. George Lucas knew that he wanted Anakin to have an apprentice, but throughout the show, Ahsoka became so much more. She evolved from a plucky upstart to a seasoned warrior and wise mentor. She became the eyes through which the audience saw the realities of the war, the eyes of a child that were forced to harden too quickly, to make choices that were too hard, and lift the burdens she should never have been asked to bear. I mean, even when those she trusted most turned their backs on her. And by the end of it all, she became so respected that an entire legion of clone troopers swore to stand by her side no matter what. And for those that haven't experienced this depth of story in animation before, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, it's a performance unlike any other in Star Wars. And then there's one of Ahsoka's best friends and another one of my absolute favorites, Captain Rex. Now, the Clone Wars did wonders to expand the role of, well, the clones. I mean, who were once simply CGI replications of Tamira Morrison, became individuals with varied backstories, complex emotions, and a wide assortment of hairstyles, and even a few face tattoos. But for my money, Rex stands above them all. Throughout the show, Rex exemplifies what it means to be a clone. To follow orders, yes, but also how to inspire loyalty from your brothers in the field. To work alongside the Jedi, to face the horrors of war with compassion and determination. I mean, thanks to the Clone Wars, the J-guys on Rex's helmet are not simply a cool image to put on a shirt or a jacket, although, yes they are, and yes I own both. They are a symbol of a man who is more than a number and is a leader and example of everything we should all strive to become. And those two barely scrape the surface of iconic original characters that create their legacies inside the show. But perhaps even more impressive is how the Clone Wars takes pre-existing legends and reforms them into even more wondrous creations than we could have ever imagined. An audacious risk, to say the least, but one that pays off in spades. Throughout Star Wars, we love to look at the Golden Trio, the 3 characters that make up the center of the heroes during each era. Think Han, Luke, and Leia, or Rey, Finn, and Poe. But for my generation, nothing quite hits as hard as Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Padme. And not only do these 3 characters make appearances in the Clone Wars, they're main features of the show. Their look is completely stylized, their voice actors are all different from the originals, and yet they fit in perfectly. And moreover, their characterizations are actually better than in the prequels. Now hold on, don't get me wrong. I love these 3 in episodes 1, 2, and 3. But there are so many moments that we don't get to see in those movies that are expanded beautifully within the Clone Wars. I mean, wouldn't you love to see Anakin and Padme happy during their marriage? Or perhaps moments where Anakin and Obi-Wan continue to solidify their brotherly bond. They're all here in the show. And by the end, as an audience member, you understand the love between these characters so much more than before, even if you didn't even think that would be possible. And beyond their internal connections, the medium of television allows us to witness these characters we know and love evolve amidst the larger conflict. How are they on their good days? How are they on their bad days? Are there signs of the path that Anakin may eventually take? Hint, yes. Yes, there are. Within the journeys taken by these characters, old and new, the Clone Wars showcases the real cost of war, both externally and internally, and in doing so, it creates a living, breathing universe that is actually the closest we get to George Lucas's fully realized dreams. Dave Filoni gets a lot of credit for the success of the Clone Wars, and rightly so. But folks that are a bit more unfamiliar with the show may not know that the idea came right from the creator himself. George Lucas was involved with the Clone Wars from jump, and the more you learn about him, the more that every decision involving the creation and execution of the show makes sense. Even though George made his name as one of the great filmmakers of all time, a lot of inspiration for Star Wars came from more episodic mediums. I mean, hey, there's a reason that the movies themselves are listed as episodes. But for years, George was very vocal about his love for Flash Gordon serials and old Adventure of the Week programs that inspired him during his youth. So why wouldn't he want to bring that type of storytelling to his own mythology? Because yes, Lucas always envisioned Star Wars as a massive saga, a modern mythos of which we were only seeing a small part at any one time. But when you're envisioning something this big, you're envisioning a universe where all kinds of stories are possible. So with the Clone Wars, George and Dave got to explore that variety to the fullest. They got to tell silly stories, serious stories, stories of action, stories of calm. At his core, George believed that the kids of today and tomorrow deserved to gain access to every type of story imaginable. And when you have over 20 episodes a season and the ability to film on a different planet every week, the only limit was his imagination. Well, and a budget. But believe it or not, even the budget of the show fits into Lucas's overall vision. Let me explain. Arguably the best thing about George Lucas is his vision. And yes, this can apply to his vision for the Skywalker saga, but it also applies to his vision for the future of storytelling. The original and prequel trilogies broke countless boundaries when it came to how movies were made in a technological sense. And that same kind of evolution can be seen directly in the Clone Wars. Now, if you begin your Clone Wars journey right at the beginning, you'll experience some great stories, but you'll also see some animation that feels a bit dated at this point. I mean, the textures aren't quite as crisp and the movements aren't completely fluid. But if you compare that to Season 7, oh my God. See, the Clone Wars aren't just a journey of the advancement of the war between the Republic and the Separatists. They're actually a journal of the evolution of an entire art form. Because George was always looking to push the boundaries of new artistic technology, so was the entire team behind the Clone Wars throughout the run. So each season, the models got more detailed, the environments got more dense, and the way the animators were able to manipulate the digital camera to create jaw-dropping set pieces, it changed the game forever. Because the Clone Wars doesn't represent just a love for Star Wars, for galaxy building, for character enrichment. It represents the relentless determination required to advance filmmaking and storytelling that has been present in the saga since A New Hope. The Clone Wars is one of my favorite pieces of Star Wars media that exists. And I didn't even watch it until I was an adult. I missed it during the initial run on Cartoon Network, and when a buddy of mine offered to lend me his DVDs, I didn't really want to buy into some kids show. But once I got rid of that minor barrier, I was exposed to, well, all of this. Is every episode great? No. Is every story arc life-changing? No. But does the show allow me to live in my favorite universe and embrace the wonder of creation that only Star Wars can bring? Without question. I mean, without stories like Umbara or Mortis and characters like Ahsoka and Rex, Star Wars would be something completely different for me. And I'm so beyond thankful that George, Dave, and the entire crew kept fighting for what they believed in. So if you've never tried out the Clone Wars, I think it's time to head over to Disney Plus and change that. You can start right at the beginning, but if you want to go right to an episode with high stakes, great animation, and a bit of storytelling already under its belt, check out Season 2, Episode 5, Landing at Point Rain. For my money, this is where you can really start to understand the gravity of what the Clone Wars can provide, and trust me, you never look back. And if you have a different arc that you start with or a favorite episode, leave it down in the comments. Let people know how much you love this show so they can join with us. And until next time, may the Force be with you.